My name is Fallon Greer, and I am 28 years old. 3 weeks ago, my brother stood in the middle of my grandmother's bakery and told everyone assembled there that I had been stealing from her for the last 2 years. He said it in a flat, rehearsed voice, like a man who had practiced until the feeling wore off. He said it because his wife told him to, and she told him to because the bakery sat on the corner of Main and Birch, in a town that a commercial developer had just decided was worth acquiring, and the building my grandmother owned free and clear stood directly in the path of those plans. I hadn't stolen a dollar. I had kept the books every week, covered 3 separate shortfalls out of my own paycheck without telling a soul, and driven 40 minutes each way every Thursday evening to help my grandmother count the till. Because her hands had developed a tremor she was too proud to mention to anyone but me. But I didn't have a lawyer, and I did have access to that register, and those 2 facts together were all my sister-in-law needed. What none of them knew, not my brother, not my aunts, not the cousins who stopped returning my texts that week, was that 4 days before my brother stood there and said those words, his wife had hit reply all on an email chain and accidentally included me. My address had been in that thread for months, left over from a catering inquiry she'd sent me the previous spring. She hadn't noticed it was still there. I had already printed the email before they knew I had it, made 3 copies, put 1 in a folder, 1 in my car, 1 in a kitchen drawer at my friend Tansy's apartment, with a note that said, "Do not lose this." My grandmother had run a small business for 31 years. She taught me that a paper trail is only useful if you have more than 1 copy of it. 12 days after that afternoon in the bakery, all 3 of them came to my door with an offer they considered generous. The email had been with my attorney for a week. But that is the end. The end only makes sense if you know what came before it. So let me tell you about the bakery first. Let me tell you what my grandmother built, and what it cost me to protect it, and what it cost someone else not to care.
Huh?
My grandmother, everyone called her Grandma Clover, even people who weren't family, even the mailman, opened the bakery in 1991 in a storefront that had been a hardware store before the hardware business moved to the edge of town. She painted the door yellow. She put a handwritten menu in the window and stayed open 6 days a week for 31 years. Her name was on the sign. Her cinnamon rolls were the kind people drove for. She knew the names of every regular and the names of most of their children. And when my mother died in a car accident when I was 9, she was the one who came to the school to get me, because my father had already left the state and there wasn't anyone else. I grew up in that bakery. I did my homework at the table in the back. I learned to make pie crust on a Saturday when I was 11. By the time I was 14, I could open the shop alone and have the first batch of biscuits out of the oven before my grandmother arrived. It was never a burden. It was just where I was from. The smell of that kitchen, brown sugar, yeast, the specific warmth of a commercial oven at 6 in the morning, is the smell of every place I have ever felt safe. My brother Lane is 3 years older than me. We grew up together in my grandmother's house, and when he went to college, I stayed and kept helping, and that is not a complaint. It is just what happened. He came back with a business degree and a girlfriend named Bryn, who was organized and ambitious and had very strong opinions about what things were worth. She shook my grandmother's hand the first Thanksgiving she came to and looked at the bakery the way a person looks at a piece of real estate, not at a place where food comes from. I noticed it. I told myself it was nothing. I had been telling myself things were nothing for a long time by then, and I was very good at it. Grandma Clover's health started slipping 2 years ago. A small stroke in February that she tried to explain away as exhaustion, and I was the one who drove her to the follow-up appointments, the one who sat beside her while the doctor explained what the imaging showed. She didn't want Lane to know. "He'll make a fuss," she said, meaning he would tell Bryn, and Bryn would start asking questions about the will. I didn't argue. I had already reached the same conclusion on my own. We worked out a system. I drove down every Thursday. I helped with the books, handled the vendor calls she kept forgetting, made sure payroll went out right. My grandmother was sharp in most ways, but the numbers had started slipping through the cracks in a way they never had before. I quietly filled those gaps, because the bakery wasn't just a business to her. It was the thing she had made from nothing. Letting it fail would have been a different kind of dying. I covered 3 shortfalls over 14 months, totaling just under $4,000. I kept every receipt in a folder labeled with dates and amounts. Not because I expected to be reimbursed, but because my grandmother had taught me to document everything, and some lessons stay in the body even when you've stopped thinking about them. The spring before everything fell apart, Bryn started coming around more. She had never shown much interest in the day-to-day before, but suddenly she had suggestions about the menu, and questions about the lease, and very specific opinions about property tax assessments, which is not the kind of thing people get curious about unless they are already thinking about what a piece of property might do for them. There was an afternoon in April when I arrived for the Thursday count and found her in the back office with the lease agreement open on the desk. She smiled. "Your grandmother asked me to look at the renewal terms," she said. My grandmother was standing at the front counter and did not look like she had asked anyone to do anything. "I've got the books," I said. "Of course," Bryn said, and she gathered the lease and left before anything else could be said. I mentioned it to my grandmother after Bryn's car was gone. She was quiet for a long moment. "She's been asking me about the building," she said finally. "What it's worth. Whether I've had it appraised." I told her I wasn't interested in what it's worth. "I know what it's worth to me." She sounded tired. Not angry, just tired. I drove home that night with both hands on the wheel, and my mind somewhere else entirely. My grandmother had a will. She had drawn it up 11 years earlier and updated it twice. The bakery and the building were left to me. The house on Sycamore was to be divided equally between Lane and me. She told me this herself, plainly, without ceremony, the way she told me most important things. "I'm telling you so you know," she said, "and so there's no confusion later. Lane has Bryn, and Bryn has opinions, and I want you to know what's yours." What she couldn't have anticipated was that the will would be contested before the ink on the death certificate was dry. She passed in October, quietly, in a hospital room I sat beside for 3 days. Lane came on the second day. Bryn stood in the doorway and did not come in. Within 2 weeks of the funeral, Bryn had found a lawyer to challenge the will, on the grounds that my grandmother had not been of sound mind when she signed the updated version. The argument was thin, but legal arguments don't have to be strong to be effective. They only have to be slow. While the challenge was pending, the bakery's ownership was frozen in legal uncertainty. I could not sell it, could not refinance it, could not make any major decisions about it without a court's approval. That was the point of the challenge. Not to win in court. To create a window, to stall the transfer long enough to do what needed to be done. I did not understand that yet. I thought they were grieving badly. I thought Bryn had convinced Lane that something was wrong with the will, and Lane had gone along with it the way he always went along with things she decided, and I was generous with my interpretation of his motivations for longer than I should have been. The family gathered in late November to go through my grandmother's things. Cousins, aunts, a few neighbors close enough to count. It was my Aunt Odessa's idea, meant to be healing. I drove to town and arrived to find the bakery unlocked, and Bryn set up at the back table with a legal pad and what appeared to be an inventory sheet, moving through the small office with an efficiency that had nothing to do with grief. There was a lockbox on the desk I had never seen before. My grandmother had kept petty cash in an envelope in the top drawer, not a lockbox. I asked Bryn about it, and she said she'd found it in the closet and was making sure everything was accounted for. I let it go because there was a room full of family, and I didn't want to be the one who made things ugly. That was my mistake. Not the only one, but the one I come back to most. An hour later, Bryn stood at the counter and said, in a calm and organized voice, that there was a significant discrepancy in the cash records going back 14 months. She said it with the practiced composure of a person who had rehearsed not just the words, but the pauses between them. She looked at me when she said it. Fallon had the books, she said. Fallon had the keys. I think we need to talk about what happened to that money. The room went very quiet. My brother looked at the floor. My Aunt Odessa looked at me, and then looked away. The cousins looked at each other, and I stood there in the place where I had learned to make pie crust and understand that some people will love you fiercely, even when the world gives them no good reason to, and I understood that the verdict in this room had been reached before I walked in. I said calmly that I had covered those shortfalls myself and that I had receipts. I had been covering gaps for 14 months. My grandmother had known. I had kept records. I said all of it in the same room where I had once been 11 years old, learning that butter has to be cold to make the crust work. Bryn said that was a very convenient explanation. Lane said nothing. Lane, who I had called the night our grandmother had the stroke, because I didn't know who else to call, and he was my brother. Lane stood at the edge of that room and looked at the doorframe like it was the most important thing in it. I left. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because some rooms have already decided their verdict, and speaking into that kind of silence costs more than it returns. I drove to Tansy's apartment, where she made soup without asking if I was hungry, and said nothing until I was ready to talk, and I was very grateful for both of those things. 2 days later, my employer's HR department received a formal complaint, filed by a family member. It alleged that I had a pattern of handling money improperly. I worked in medical billing. I had access to payment records. The complaint was careful and specific and landed exactly where it was designed to land. I was placed on administrative review pending investigation. I sat in the parking lot after that meeting and thought about how precisely a person has to understand your life to know exactly which part of it to use as a weapon. That night, I came home and found 3 emails in my inbox. 2 were from extended family, carefully worded, expressing concern. The third was from my sister-in-law's work account. She had hit reply all. My address was still in the thread from a catering request she'd sent me the previous spring. She hadn't noticed. The chain ran between Bryn and a development consultant at a company called Crestline Meridian Group. It went back 4 months. In the third message from the top, dated 6 weeks before my grandmother's funeral, Bryn had written, "The property is ideal for what you've described. Current operator is elderly, and the estate situation will be straightforward once we clear a small challenge. Timeline for transfer should be Q1 at the latest. Cash discrepancy in the books predates any current involvement. I've verified this. Once we establish standing as co-heirs, path to sale is clean." I read it 4 times. Cash discrepancy in the books predates any current involvement. I've verified this. She had gone into those books herself. She had confirmed, to herself, to this developer, that the money was gone before she ever touched anything. And then she had stood in my grandmother's bakery and pointed at me. I printed the chain, 3 copies, 1 in the folder, 1 in an envelope to my attorney, 1 at Tansy's with a note. Then I did what my grandmother would have done. I said nothing publicly, and I kept working, and I waited. The neighbor who ran the flower shop 2 doors down, a woman named Shelby, who had been in that building since 2004, had seen me arrive every Thursday evening for almost 2 years. She had also seen Bryn's car parked in the alley behind the bakery twice in the month before my grandmother died. On days Bryn had told Lane she was out of town. Shelby had mentioned it to my grandmother once. My grandmother had said she didn't know why Bryn would be parking there, and Shelby had remembered that conversation because she remembered most things that seemed off to her. She also had on her phone a photograph she had taken of a business card tucked into the bakery's back door handle on a Tuesday in September. A card with the Crestline Meridian logo. She had photographed it because it seemed odd, and photographing odd things was a habit her late husband had found endearing, and her kids found annoying. I found it extremely useful. My attorney submitted the email chain and the photograph as part of the response to the will challenge. The challenge was withdrawn 11 days later. The bakery transferred to me without further contest. My HR review concluded the same week when I produced the dated receipts for every dollar I had put into those books. A clean paper trail going back 14 months, and the review board found no evidence of improper conduct. My administrative status was lifted. None of it announced itself with fanfare. There was just paperwork arriving, calls from my attorney, and a letter from Lane's lawyer that said his client was withdrawing the challenge and wished to resolve remaining matters informally. Which is how the three of them ended up on my porch on a Thursday evening. A day I would always associate now with counting tills and telling the truth about what numbers say. Bryn spoke first. She was wearing something expensive and neutral, the kind of coat you wear when you want to look reasonable. She said my name twice before she got to the ask. She said this had all been a misunderstanding. She said Lane had been grief-stricken and had made poor decisions. She said she took responsibility for things escalating the way they did. She said all of it smoothly, breathing at exactly the right moments, in the voice of a person who has prepared the script and practiced the delivery. Then the ask. If I was willing to release the family from any further legal action, they were prepared to offer me a fair price for the building. They already had a number from the development group. It was, she said, more than fair given the current market. Lane stood behind her and looked at my porch light. My nephew, Lane's boy, 7 years old, who had sat at the back table in my grandmother's bakery exactly once and eaten so many cinnamon rolls he had gone quiet the whole drive home, stood on the sidewalk holding his father's hand. He was looking at the yellow door. I thought about my grandmother painting that door. I thought about her saying, "I'm telling you so you know," and "so there's no confusion later." I thought about the word later and everything she had tried to protect me from in advance and how right she had been about most of it. I forwarded the email to my attorney 2 weeks ago, I said. The building transferred yesterday. There isn't anything left to negotiate. Bryn opened her mouth. The email you sent me by mistake, I said. The Crestline Meridian chain. The one where you wrote that the cash discrepancy predated your involvement, your words. You verified it yourself, and then you stood in her bakery and told everyone it was mine. The porch was very quiet. I'm not angry with you for wanting the building, I said, because I had decided to say the true thing rather than the satisfying thing, and the true thing was that I understood the math of it even if I didn't understand the rest. I understand what it's worth. But it's mine. It was always going to be mine. The only thing the challenge accomplished was making sure I have an attorney's number memorized and a filing system that would satisfy an auditor. I looked at Lane then, only at Lane, because he was the only person on that porch I had ever held any real hope of reaching, and I wasn't sure I still held it, but I wanted to find out. She left it to me, I said. You heard it at the reading. You knew, and when it mattered, you chose the quiet over the true thing, the way you have done every single time it cost you something not to. I stopped there. Some sentences finish themselves better in silence than in words. Your son is welcome here anytime, I said. That door stays open for him. Then I put my hand on the edge of my door and I let it close. Slowly, without drama, because a door you close yourself is different from a door that closes on you, and I had been on the wrong side of the second kind enough times to know exactly what the difference feels like. The consequences found their way to the right addresses in their own time. The will challenge withdrawal was public record. Bryn's role in a contested estate that she had materially misrepresented was noted by attorneys on both sides, and in a town this size, attorneys talk to each other the way neighbors do. The development group quietly walked back from the project. A property with a contested provenance and an active paper trail is more trouble than a corner lot is usually worth, and they found other corners. Some doors close on their own once people can see what's been standing behind them. My HR file was cleared with a formal notation that the complaint had been made in bad faith. My manager, a woman named Lorene, who had said almost nothing during the review except to ask careful procedural questions, set a cup of coffee on my desk my first morning back and walked away without making a thing of it. That was its own kind of steadiness. Lane called once, 2 weeks after the porch. Short call. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't understood everything Bryn had been doing. I believed the first part without question. The second part I set aside, because I didn't have enough information to assess it, and didn't want to be ungenerous with the little I had. I told him I needed time. He said he understood. We ended the call in the careful way of two people who haven't yet decided what they are to each other, and are smart enough not to force it. I reopened the bakery in January with part-time staff and Shelby 2 doors down, who had opinions about the menu that turned out to be correct, and regulars, who were happy to walk an extra 10 feet to buy something from someone they'd watched carry boxes and say good morning for 20 years. The yellow door is still yellow. The cinnamon rolls are still the same recipe. The handwritten menu is still the one my grandmother wrote out in her careful cursive, which I had photographed on my phone 2 years ago for no particular reason, except that it looked like something I might want to remember. My nephew came on a Saturday in February, brought by Odessa, who had arranged it quietly with Lane and not mentioned it to Bryn. He ate 2 cinnamon rolls and sat at the back table where I had done my homework as a child, and he asked me if the commercial mixer was loud because he was considering whether he might want to learn to use one. I told him yes, but you get used to it. He thought about this with the full seriousness of a 7-year-old evaluating a piece of equipment and said, "Okay, that counted for something." More than I let myself show him because he's 7 and shouldn't have to carry any of the weight of what happened between the adults in his family. The records are still in the folder. I don't keep it visible the way I did when everything was uncertain, but I haven't put it away either. My grandmother kept receipts for 31 years because she said a business is only as honest as its paperwork, and paperwork is only as useful as the person who was careful enough to keep it. I was careful enough. She taught me that, not in a lesson, but in the way she moved through a kitchen, the way she dated every container in the walk-in. The way she said, put that in writing about things that other people left to memory and goodwill. I thought I was just learning to bake. I was learning something else entirely. The yellow door is still yellow. Her name is still on the sign above it. I kept it there deliberately, because some arguments are made with a chisel rather than a word, and that felt like the right one to make permanently. I open the bakery at 6. I count the till with my own hands. I keep the books current and the recipe exact, and the door the same shade of yellow she chose in 1991, because some things are worth protecting, not because they are valuable, but because someone loved them and made them by hand and asked you to keep them honest. I keep both of those things, the folder and the door, right where I can see them.